In The Lord of the Rings, it's stated that Gandalf and the other wizards arrived in the year 1000 of the Third Age, just as the Shadow was beginning to reappear in Middle-earth. But like with many things, Tolkien changed his mind in later years and began writing notes that suggested that this was not entirely true, and that the wizards arrived earlier, or at the very least, had been to Middle-earth before. So in this video, we talk about the Five Guardians, Gandalf's first adventure in Middle-earth. Okay, so yes, as I stated, the Istari, the wizards, Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the Blue Wizards, Alatar and Pallando, were originally said to have arrived in the year 1000 of the Third Age, sent by the Valar to aid the Free Peoples of Middle-earth in the fight against Sauron. This was Tolkien's line of thinking for many years, but he did eventually make some major changes. But that was to the Blue Wizards. They would be renamed to Morineta and Romastamo, and they would arrive in the middle of the Second Age, and whereas in the beginning their fates were ambiguous, Tolkien changed it so that they would play a pivotal role in sabotaging Sauron's dominion over the south and east. As for the other three wizards, there were no changes to their origin story. They would arrive in the Third Age, Saruman selected by Aule, Gandalf by Manwë and Vardar, Radagast by Yavanna. If you're wondering, in this original version, the Blue Wizards were selected by Orome. In this short little narrative, Gandalf, as Elorin, expresses that he does not want to go to Middle-earth. He loves being amongst the elves, and he is fearful of Sauron and believes he is too weak to face him. It's for this exact reason that Manwë believes he should go. But in 1959, Tolkien reimagined the awakening of the elves at Cuivianen in the First Age, and in that reimagining, he decided to expand the role of Melian, the Maya wife of King Thingol, and he decided to expand the role of the wizards. In this version of events, they would be known as the Five Guardians, although with Melian, they would actually be six, and they would play the important role of defending the early elves from the servants of Morgoth. Let's backtrack a bit. In the Silmarillion, when the elves first awake, they live in peace for a while, but owing to his proximity, Morgoth discovers them before the Valar do. He begins sending his servants out to harass them and to mislead them. During this time, it's believed that the first orcs were created from captured elves. Eventually, the Valar Orome, who spent plenty of time hunting in Middle-earth, comes across the elves and dwells amongst them for a while. He briefly returns to Valinor, informing the other Valar about the elves, before returning to Cuivianen once again. Shortly afterwards, the Valar launch their war against Morgoth in order to protect the elves. The war goes for around 100 years, but in the end, Morgoth is defeated and taken back to Valinor as a captive. In the Silmarillion, it's only after this that the Valar decide to bring the elves to Valinor, where they can be better protected. Orome returns to the elves yet again and extends the invitation, but the elves initially refuse. In an attempt to convince the elves, Orome decides to take 3 ambassadors with him back to Valinor, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. This is successful, as the returning ambassadors manage to convince the majority of the elves to begin their great journey to Valinor. But in 1959, Tolkien decided he wanted to make some changes to the timeline. Instead of having the elves go to Valinor after the war with Morgoth, he decided he wanted them to move before or during the war. The reason being that the Valar would have been worried about the damage that would be done to Middle-earth, and therefore, the elves. He came up with 3 new timelines, but never properly completed any of them, nor did he find a way to slot them in a way that would make them consistent with the rest of the timeline. Honestly, even after looking at them for what felt like hours, it was still difficult for me to figure out what Tolkien was actually going for here. However, these 3 new timelines gave us new details that don't appear in the Silmarillion. For example, the expanded role of the Valar Tulkas, as well as the concept of the Five Guardians, led by Melian. In fact, the one consistent statement across the 3 timelines is that it's actually Melian who first goes to Middle-earth after she receives a vision of the awakening of the elves. While it isn't said that she is actually the first to find them, it does give us some explanation as to why she could later be found in Middle-earth. In these new timelines, much like in the Silmarillion, Orome finds the elves first and spends time amongst them. However, in these new timelines, Morgoth is much more proactive, and actually tries to attack Orome during his visit, who sends word back to Valinor, and as a result, Tulkas is sent to Cuivianen as a deterrent to Morgoth. Remember, Morgoth was deathly afraid of Tulkas. Because Tulkas has arrived, Orome can now return and bring his full report about the elves, and it's here when the Valar decide that they should bring the elves to Valinor, and then that they should attack Morgoth. This is a major departure from the Silmarillion, where the Battle of the Powers is a relatively spontaneous attack, whereas in this version, there's a lot more planning involved. It involves Orome going back and forth from Valinor to Cuiviénen. In at least one of these timelines, he takes the 3 Elven ambassadors back with him. This stream of activity makes Morgoth suspicious. He's now worried that the Valar are planning on attacking him, so he strengthens his western fortress of Angband and puts Sauron in command. He's correct about this, and at one point, both Tulkas and Orome are required back in Valinor in order to take part in the preparations for the war against Morgoth. But the elves cannot be left undefended, so the 5 Guardians, led by Melian, are sent to protect them at Cuiviénen while the Valar are gone. These 5 Guardians are Tarandor, later known as Saruman, Olorin, who is Gandalf, Hravendil, later known as Radagast, and Palisando and Hallimar, probably more names for the Blue Wizards. It's unknown if they did more than simply guard the elves, or whether they interacted with them or not, or how long they stayed with them. In the 3rd timeline Tolkien wrote, during the Great Journey to Valinor, Orome has to abandon the march on several occasions to take part in the war against Morgoth, suggesting that Melian and the 5 Guardians might have still been required to guard the elves during these occasions. It's an interesting change. In regards to Melian, it makes it seem like her meeting with Elwë, King Thingol, in Doriath was much less random, as she had already been amongst the elves and was probably already aware of Thingol given his important status as an elven ambassador. Likewise, in regards to the wizards, it sort of overrules the narrative that appears in the Unfinished Tales, where each wizard was selected by a different Valar. In this version, it makes sense to have chosen those particular 5 wizards. They had already been to Middle-earth together in the First Age, where they had worked together as part of a higher purpose against the darkness. But like many things Tolkien wrote, in the end, the timelines were never properly completed, and as a result, the idea of the 5 Guardians went into the dustbin. And considering that the idea of the 5 Guardians was conceived in 1959, and Tolkien wrote plenty of things in the years that followed, it seemed like he had abandoned the idea, or at the very least, was more concerned with other aspects of the lore. So while the 5 Guardians are an interesting detail, it actively clashes with pretty much everything else we know about the Astari. So yeah, while Tolkien, at least at one point, envisioned Gandalf as having a First Age adventure, it's not the same Gandalf that we see in The Lord of the Rings. And honestly, I'm actually glad about that when it comes to this one. While I enjoy certain characters having expanded roles, such as Tulkas or Melian on this occasion, I don't think the Astari needed to have a history in Middle-earth before they arrived in the Second and Third Age. Having them appear in the First Age as well, in a not too dissimilar role, it feels like it's the same characters doing the same things over and over again. It feels like overkill to me. Sure, have Maya that gets sent to guard the elves, but have it be different ones, have new characters. So yeah, one of those admittedly rare occasions when I'm glad some of Tolkien's changes don't exactly fit into canon. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. You may have noticed that a few of my recent videos are including quite a bit of stuff from the nature of Middle-earth. That's because, apart from a single live stream I did a couple years ago, I haven't actually spoken about a lot of the cool little details that appear in that book. Whenever I find something interesting, some lesser-known stuff, you can be assured that it will eventually make its way to this channel. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the fast food restaurant Five Guys is actually a reference to the 5 Guardians.